And I got myself into a bad situation. Then I could hear the breathing. This thing was so angry, I could feel the sound waves. Honestly, one showed up in front of me. And prior to that, this was in January of 2000. Prior to that, I was what you would call a Bigfoot agnostic. Heard stories, things like that, and never really thought much about them. And when presented with something that was unexplainable, something that wasn't supposed to be there, it was kind of a life-changing experience for me.
Well, tell me about that experience in detail.
Okay. Um, at the time, I was living and working in Western Maryland, and the young lady that I was dating had two small children. And when we were presented with a rather warm day for that type of year, that time of year, about 60 degrees up to a high, so you don't waste those kind of days. We went out and took our kids on a picnic, which turned into an afternoon of visiting friends, turned into going out to dinner. We got in rather late. Um, her home is off the beaten path. In fact, sits within about 40 or 50 feet of of a forest. And the way her house is configured, the driveway goes up a hill, and then there's a house, and the driveway actually there's a circle around it. It absolutely um, the pass the driveway passes between the house and the woods. It was about 9 or 10 at night, somewhere around in there. And as we got out of the vehicle, it was very easy to hear that there was something, big moving in the woods. There was no doubt about that. In that part of the country, the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, you immediately think black bear, and because it sounded much bigger than any deer I've ever heard. So, she hustled her kids inside. It became my job to pick up all the dishes and unused food from the picnic that day. And I didn't want to make two trips, when it was dark outside. There's a black bear roaming around. So I filled up my arms. I mean, I was just had everything there. So it was left to my elbow to put the hatchback of her car down and pushed it down. And I got inside, no big deal. A few minutes later, after she had got her kids settled and to bed, she went to the back door there to look and see if she could see the bear, and she noticed that my elbow was rather inefficient in that task, and the dome light of her car was on, and she didn't want to have to her battery run down. She had to be at work the next day, so somebody had to go out there and close that close that down. So chivalry is not dead. I'll report that to you. I decided I was going to be me, and I'd spent enough time in the woods, doing different things, hunting when I was younger, and a lot of hiking and stuff like that. So I knew that I didn't want to walk out there with my eyes unadjusted to the dark, because it just didn't make a lot of sense. Yeah, black bear is going to be tough enough to see under the conditions, and I wanted to make sure that I had every chance to be able to see the animal if it was coming out there. So I stood at the back door, turned off the porch light, turned off the light in the mudroom that was there at the back of the house, and just stared outside for a few minutes to make sure my eyes were adjusting. And the it wasn't completely dark at that point. I can tell you that I don't know if it was a full moon or it was close to a full moon, but there was a lot of moonlight, and there was actually a light post about 200 feet to my left, because that's where the driveway split off, and one side went over towards her house, another side went up the hill towards a house where her uncle lived. And that they put the lamppost there so you could see the division between the two the fork in the driveway. So there was some light, there was some ambient light out there, and it wasn't so bad. I didn't feel too bad after a few minutes. So stepped outside, and I'm walking towards the car, which is about 20 feet away. And all the time, my view is to my right, forward and right. And it's on a certain spot in the tree line because the whole tree line of the woods there is all bushes and briars. And in my mind, I'm looking for a bear. And bears aren't stupid. They're not going to try and go through all that, try to get to somebody or anything, because the chances of them getting hurt doing it are just as high. I mean, they're going to take the path of least resistance the same we would. So there was one gap in that bushes and briars off to my right where it was about a 15-foot wide gap where all the bushes and briars have been beaten down and trampled down. And that was where we went back into the woods to go hiking. We took our kids back in the woods to play a little bit. And unbeknownst to me at the time, that was where my lady friend would take food that was about to go bad and dump it out there so animals could eat it. So, but the bushes and briars rose up about 5 feet to where the canopy of the trees hung down. So it was about a 5 foot high, 15-foot wide gap in that tree line, and that's where I was watching because that's where I pretty much knew if there was going to be any action of that animal coming out of the woods, it would be there. Well, I got to the back of the car, and all the time my eyes are on this gap, and I put my hand on the hatchback of the car and I push down on it, and the light goes out. As I'm pushing down in that gap the in the tree line, I see motion, I see movement. And what struck me about it, this is weird point number one of this encounter, was that the motion that I saw wasn't going across that gap and it wasn't coming out of that gap. The motion that I saw was straight down. And it caught my eye and I stared at it, and it was to the left edge of this gap, and I could see a shape in that gap. And the first thing I noted about that shape was that it was huge. The head of it was right at that canopy of the trees, about 5 feet up. And as I looked at it, my first impression was that I could see broad, straight out shoulders. And in my mind, I'm thinking this is a bear. And I'm looking at this bear, and it immediately hits me that bears don't have shoulders like that. Bears are slope shouldered, especially when they're seated, which is what I thought happened, was that I just went there and sat down. And I didn't realize it at the time, but what I was experiencing was a phenomenon called cognitive dissonance, which is where you're getting input, whether it's visual, verbal, whatever, and your brain's just not processing it. It's just not grasping what's going on. And I just sat there and thought to myself, this is the weirdest looking bear I've ever seen. And as I stared at it some more and watched it some more, I could see in front of it knees that were poking up, kind of like this, kind of like at angles, like it was crouching. And I said, at the point of going, what kind of bear sits like that? Because bears, when they sit down, they do like a dog does and sit down on its haunches, or they sit down on their behind and their feet stick straight out. And I'm just puzzling on this thing. These are the strange things that are going through my head at that time. And I'm just saying, what kind of bear is this? And it must have been a minute, or more that I sat there and stared at this thing. It's 40 feet from me. I'm trying to figure out what was going on. And then from behind me, I hear my lady friend, she's at the door. I hear her go, "What are you trying to do? Get killed?" And that kind of snapped me back to. So I decided to just back up, and I kind of backed around the backside of the car and had my eyes on this thing the whole time backing up. And then when I got about 20 feet or so, 15 feet, 20 feet or so, I mean, I had about 10 feet to go. I just sort of turned and walked because the thing hadn't moved, and I figured to be okay. And I just walked back into the house. No problem. No big deal. We sat there for, sat up for a while, make sure nothing was wrong. There were no incidents that happened. And, I didn't think much of it after that. I talked to a few friends of mine that were avid hunters out in that area. And they said, "Oh, come on, there's nothing in those woods that big or anything like that." And I would have to explain to them, "Yeah, I know what I saw. This thing was huge. You guys got to keep your eyes open, that kind of thing." Uh, Fast forward 5 years. Okay, I was no longer with this lady again. I had met the lady who became my wife, and we had moved to Orlando, Florida. And one of the things I deal with periodically is that is insomnia. And I had a bout of insomnia one night, and flipping through the TV channels at 3 o'clock in the morning, I came upon a show about Bigfoot, and I remember saying the words out loud, "This will put me to sleep." And watched the show. About 15 minutes in, there was a gentleman on there from the state of Washington who described what he had seen, and it was about a 95% match to what I had seen 5 years previous in Maryland. He had experienced one of the creatures on his front porch, crouching down, and his description was almost exactly what I remembered. It triggered that memory in my head, and 5 years later, and 1,000 miles removed from that experience, a ran down my spine. I walked into the bathroom to splash some water on my face, and all the color had drained from my face. The shock um, of that incident, and knowing that that thing was sitting there 40 feet from me, could have done whatever it wanted to do, and there's nothing I could have done about it. And it really struck me. And that's when, in 2005, that the way that everybody puts it is that it gets into your blood, and you're fascinated by the subject. You're fascinated by finding out the truth, and that's what I've been doing ever since, is researching and trying to find out the truth about what I experienced that night. And since then, I've had 3 more encounters.
Well, let's talk about those encounters that you've had. And I assume that those happened through your research.
Yes, yes, and to be honest with you, 2 of them were the result of aligning myself with very good people who are doing very good work, and the other one was out of let's just put it out of kind of a rookie zeal of going out and doing field research, and I got myself into a bad situation.
Well, let's take them one at a time and just go over them in detail.
Okay. My second encounter was in southwestern Colorado. I had met a couple of researchers online, and I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and so we met in a town that was about midway between, and we started making plans about me joining them in some of their research. And their idea was that they had a canyon, a small canyon that they knew there was activity in, and they had already placed a bear stand, like basically just a seat that attached to a tree at one end of this canyon. And what their plan was to put somebody in that seat, and then have everybody down at the other end of the canyon, and have a big group that just walks and just kind of drives whatever wildlife there is towards that seat. I got the assignment of being in that chair. So it was about 25 feet up, and I was in that chair for maybe 3 hours, and before I actually heard anything or did anything. I didn't have any thermal gear or anything like that. We didn't have the budget for that kind of equipment. So I could hear things running through, like I could hear some deer and some elk running through. As the group approached, and I could hear the group in the distance. And periodically, I would hear something run and then stop, and then run and then stop, and then run and then stop. and it didn't sound like everybody else, or like anything else that was going through there. It didn't sound like it was running on 4 feet. It sounded 2-footed. And, of course, I get excited and get pumped up. And then the noise runs straight towards me. And if it was under the tree, I don't know if it was under the tree I was in or whether it was in close proximity to that tree, I could hear the breathing. I could hear the footsteps coming up, and then I could hear the breathing. And at that point, I realized I wasn't ready to be able to record any data from this thing. So I took my phone, trying to get the thing opened up and get it get it going. And the thing must have heard me, and I could hear it take off running. And when we got there, or when we got the group together and everything like that, I told them about it, and they said they could hear something out ahead of them. And they had heard grunts and barks from the thing, but it hadn't made any of those noises when I was close, and I hadn't heard any of those. So they were, that we were pretty convinced that we had some activity in that canyon that night. And they since then have moved to a more northern location in Colorado, so I can't work with them very much at all. And I turned to starting to do some research in my area in northern New Mexico. And the next encounter, see, that was in 2011. And then in 2013, I had my next encounter, and that was here in New Mexico. And that was the one where I made a lot of mistakes. I had found that there was a town north of here. I saw in the newspaper where this town had a recent spike in missing dogs and cats. And from the research that I've been doing and everything, I'd understood that dogs and cats were vulnerable. They were vulnerable food animals for the creatures, and it spiked my interest. And there had been some sightings up in that region, so I started to do research and started to really start to trace around that town. And not too far from that town is a national park that's there. And I had been up there several times to be able to take a look at the ground that's between this town and this national park. And I became fairly satisfied that the creatures were in the park and would come out and had been foraging around that town. So in my research to find out and get familiar with this national park, I realized that, well, number one, they cleared the park out of visitors at dusk every day. So to be in that place at night was a crime, and that I actually decided to commit a crime because I had found a small little box canyon, you would call it. It's maybe 400 feet long and about 100 feet wide, but it's an impression down in the ground where I was pretty sure they were using that as a transit venue to come out of the park and be unseen that way. So I work in the education field, and spring break of 2013 in March, I went to this place, and up on the edge of one of those of that canyon, the edge of that canyon, I built a blind out of deadfall, and was going to sit there. So I went in there at last light, and then ended up, sitting there for the evening, and there was nothing going on. And I'm going to tell you, this was the epitome of stupidity on my part. Went out there alone, number one. Number two, I had no equipment to be able to see at night, yet I was going to be out there at night. The only thing that was going through my mind was that I was going to find evidence of these things. I was going to be the man. I was going to be that guy that was the one that was going to prove these things existed and everything like that. And that zeal just totally got in the way of my thinking. Walked out there. I had nothing to protect myself except a little camping knife and a can of bear spray. And, I'm just thoroughly unprepared. Absolutely. So sitting through that, I started to hear, after it had to be after midnight that I started to hear some calls and things like that that didn't sound like anything else, that had been out that night. And one call in particular was what what we would call a sounding, is the long, the long howl that they do, which is kind of like saying, "Hey, I'm here. This is my location." And I heard a couple of those, and I wasn't sure if they were getting closer. And then the third one I heard, I was definitely sure that it definitely, affirmed that they were coming in that direction. So sitting there, I was literally sitting on top of a 5-gallon bucket that had a seat cushion on it, and I could see above the blind. It was I could see, sit about that high. And after about an hour or so, I could hear something coming close, and I could just moving through the woods, and it didn't sound like it was trying to be careful. It was just sounded like it was walking, and it was on 2 feet. And again, there I am without any night vision gear, totally, then I realized, wow, what good is this going to do? I'm sitting here in the dark and I can barely see. And this thing stopped, I'm guessing at a range of about 20 to 25 yards. And it became noticeably agitated. It started to bark, and it started to growl, and it started I mean, the one of the sounds that it made, um, it was kind of a angry gurgling noise, and it was all directed in my direction. And I know it was because this thing was so angry, I could feel the sound waves of its barks and its vocalizations hitting me in the face. Because I could sit up that far and I could feel it hit me from about right here on up. And it was at that moment I realized just how in over my head I was at that point. And this thing started to circle around my position a little bit. And the only thing that came to my mind, and I don't, really know how I even got you know, a decent thought in my head at that point, was that you don't let an animal get behind you. So I just kind of pivoted to keep facing where the sounds were coming from. And it would go around and then come back around again. And I would just keep pivoting on that seat cushion. And it covered about a 270-degree arc around me. And all the time barking and stomping, I could feel the vibrations in the ground. It was that close, that it was doing all that. And this went on for about 40 to 45 minutes. And I honestly, the terror that was in my body at that point, I could just think those simple things of not letting it behind me, and trying not to resist the urge to run. And then at that point, I heard it rip a branch off a tree, and I could just hear it pop. When they ripped it off of there, and my initial thought was, he's going to take that thing and beat the daylights out of me with it. And about 20 or 25 seconds later, this branch lands about 7 or 8 feet to my left, and then I could hear it move off, and still barking and growling and things like that. But it eventually it moved away, and I sat there. This is about maybe 4:30 in the morning, and trying to think straight, and trying to get out of there at that point would have been tough to do. Poking my way through the dark and trying to find my way back would have been very difficult. I didn't want to use a flashlight because I didn't want to lose whatever night vision that I had. And then, I came to the conclusion I just had to sit there. I had to wait for light. And it was about, it was over an hour, maybe an hour and a half to where first, the light was where I could see anything. Um, I got my gear packed up, and as I'm doing all that, I look over to my left and there's this branch, and the base of the branch that had snapped off. The branch was about 8 or 9 feet long. The base of that branch was about this big around, and it had been thrown at least 20 or 25 yards. And that just chilled me to the bone to know that there's something out there that was that powerful. And it just, yeah, it just struck me. Gathered up my gear. I turned a 45-minute hike into about a 20-minute jog, back to my vehicle. Got everything packed up. Got in the vehicle, and car key in my hand. I was ready to put it, and I just broke down. I'm not too proud to tell you, I cried like a baby for about 10 minutes because all the stress of that incident just came through, and it was too much. It was just too much to bear, and I just had to let it all out. And you know, to this day, I have planned any excursion into the woods. Number one, not to be alone, and number two, to be thinking, a lot more forward thinking about what I'm doing. And it was a fortunate experience for me that I was able to learn from it and not have to pay the price. To learn it the hard way. I can tell you that the lessons I learned were hard enough at that point.
Did anyone know you were there?
No, I can tell you that a couple of park rangers had walked through that little box canyon, and the blind that I built must have been good because they didn't see me. So yeah, I really don't want to give away that location because I don't know if the statute of limitations is up or not. But that was another stupid thing that I had done. I had went into an area that I shouldn't have been, and when I shouldn't have been there, and I wouldn't recommend anybody to do that.
Exactly. So what was your next experience?
Didn't have another experience until 2019. In the interim, I had met a gentleman by the name of Craig Salk, and some folks may recognize that name. He was on Finding Bigfoot. I think it was season 2. The first conversation that he and I had when I told him that I was a researcher, was that we talked for over 3 hours that night, and subsequently we talked for weeks. We would call each other a couple times a week and go over our thoughts and our theories and different ideas that we had. And it was through the course of that he asked me to come up and be a speaker at that convention. And I had never done that before. The research that I had done had been really personal, and I had really kept it to myself. And he invited me up there, and that's how he and I became friends. I spoke at that first conference in 2017, I believe it was, and it was really good. And then I had gotten the idea to work to do some work related to my day job, which was working in the mental and behavioral health field with behavior challenged kids. And what I had noticed was that these kids I was working with on an everyday basis, the effects, from their trauma that they had experienced, whether it was chronic abuse, whether they had witnessed particularly violent things or accidents that had happening, the effects from that I would deal with on a daily basis. And then when I would interview Bigfoot witnesses, they would report some of the same effects, the same type of things that they were going through. And I realized the impact and the trauma that these encounters could bring. And so I decided to do a case study on that and really start to research, what those kind of traumatic effects were on people. And I ended up working on that for, 3 years. I was just starting to work on that, when I had met Craig. And so that work went on through there, and I'd gone up there in 2017 and, talked at the conference. It was a lot of fun. And then when I told him that I was nearing the end of this study and I was going to be able to publish it, he said, okay, you're coming back up here and you're going to release it here. And so I went back up there in the summer of 2019 and released those results, and then at that conference. And while I was there, I mean, he both times that was at his property, we had gone out. He has 80 acres up there, and it's a very active place. He had published one of the best trail cam photos I'd ever seen to that point of, that gives you, an image of a Bigfoot on his property. And so I'd gone out there and, set his trail cams, and we had sat out there at night and listened to the activity that was going on, and it's a fascinating place. So while I was there, the conference was on a Saturday, and I was staying at his property, and they have a very small cabin there. And so they didn't have a guest room, but they did borrow a camper that they put in their driveway, and that's where I was going to sleep. And so we had the conference on that Saturday, and then that night, I was asleep in the camper, and I heard a thump that woke me up. It was loud enough to wake me up. Now there was no vibration on the trailer or anything like that, but I definitely heard the noise, and that's what woke me. And the bed is in the back end of this trailer. So, and I'm 6'2", so those beds are only about 6 feet long. So I was sleeping diagonally. My head was basically in the back corner of this camper, and laying on my back, there's a window above my head, and there's a window to my left. And I heard that sound, that woke me up, and I laid there for a minute, and then I heard a noise that I really didn't, process. Excuse me. I wasn't. It was just too weird. I hadn't really, fixed on it, and it lasted about 4 or 5 seconds, and then it went away, and then a few seconds later it came back, about another 4 or 5 seconds, and it was just this. It was like a low groan, gurgling kind of sound, and it didn't click in my head. And then it came back a third time, and my eyes went open like this, and I was like, "That's a stomach growling. It's this, the sound of when your stomach growls." And it was to my left, and I reached for the window to get the curtains, and my hand hit the curtain rather than getting under it to be able to pull it out of the way. And so I fumbled with the curtain for a second or two, and then pulled it open. And the window went from totally black to this dark shape moving away from it. And I could see moonlight and trees behind it. And I snapped up, because it had gone down the length of the trailer. I snapped up and looked down the center aisle of this trailer. The windows at the front were the ones that had covers on them, but the covers were up to there was a gap about that far at the bottom of the window. And I looked up there, and I could see that dark shape move across the front of the trailer. And I just, I was absolutely riveted at that point. Knowing the activity that's on that property, there's there's a family group that lives there for sure. So I didn't want to walk out in the middle of the dark, a dark area, and have 2 or 3 of those things around. So I just stayed put and immediately snapped into researcher mode, and I started to write down everything in detail. And I wanted to wait for first light, which was about an hour and a half later. Walked up, knocked on the door, and let Craig and his wife know what was going on. And that's when we started to look around the area. And of course, we're in a driveway. I mean, it wasn't paved, but a driveway gets pounded down, so there's no soft area there for footprints or anything like that. We went all over the trailer looking for any hair samples or anything, And then we examined the area in front of the trailer, and it was moving at a point where where it went across the front of the trailer that would take it across the yard in front of their house. And so we examined that and we walked across the yard, and then we turned around, and you know how grass gets beat down when somebody walks on it. It gets very shiny compared to the rest of the grass around it. And we could see a clear path where something had walked through there. So we know for a fact something had been there. And the path, that walking path led out to the main road, which was about 60, 80 feet away. And we went out there, and there was nothing on this dirt road. And then we got to a gate, and that gate is to the back 40 acres of his property. And that's exactly where most of the activity was. So we walked down the access road on there, and there were puddles that were left in the road. And what we were looking for was maybe this thing had stepped in one of the puddles or something like that, because whenever something steps in a puddle, after everything settles in that puddle, it's very easy to see tracks that are in there. And we got about a quarter of a mile down this road, and that was about halfway back onto his property, and we started to get this feeling of, number one, we were being watched. Number two, it started to feel very uncomfortable for us. And I looked at him, and I said, "Do you hear that?" And he sat there and listened. And he said, "I don't hear anything." I said, "Yeah." I said, "This is June, and this is, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We're back in, kind of a swampy area, and there's no bugs, there's nothing, there's no noise whatsoever, which is a telltale sign that these things are around." And at that point, two guys on foot, we're unarmed, we got nothing to protect us. We just kind of tipped our hats and walked back out of there. We didn't want to get into a dangerous situation. So that was, it was a unique experience to be involved in a Bigfoot conference the day of, and then that night to have an experience.
And your research goes on.
It does. I published that study in the summer of 2019. The National Cryptid Society published it on their website. They were good enough to do that. And then I released it on 16 or 17 different Facebook groups that were on there. And, the research community being what it is, it's a dog eat dog place is the best way to say it. There's a lot of caustic behavior. There's a lot of, anytime any new information comes out, and there's a lot of skeptics, there's a lot of people that'll shoot it down. And I had prepared myself, to deal with the backlash that there would be off of releasing something like that. And I was kind of braced for it. And the funny thing about it was that I got crickets as a response. I mean, there were one or two people that asked, a couple of critical questions about it, and then I didn't hear anything. And I was ready for it. I was waiting. I was kind of disappointed, actually, because it's something I wanted to talk about. I had interviewed over 400 people for that study, and I'd vetted it down to 148 cases that we were, that I would have on there. The vetting process was kind of tough. One of the first things I did was eliminate anybody from the study pool that had either had a personal history or a family history of mental health diagnosis. And that was the hardest thing to do, because working in that field myself, I was not invalidating what those people were saying because of that. Not in the least. I was doing that in order to take the information pool that I was going to have and not have that excuse somebody would use to invalidate it. And again, the people that had those experiences but still had those histories, I hated to leave them out, because there were some interesting information, interesting stories that were in there. But I had to do that for the sake of the work that I was doing on that particular time. I also, went through, I had to learn some interrogation techniques to be able to talk to people and be able to have a better idea of, the validity of what they were talking about. There were some people that I talked to that where the second interview that I had with them, their story had gotten bigger and better, had been engrossed more. And that's a sure sign that there's a problem there, whether it be they're exaggerating for effect, or whether it's valid at all. So I eliminated folks like that from the study. And basically what it got down to was that there were people that were experiencing after effects of of their experiences from encountering Bigfoot that were the same as people that had been in traumatic car accidents, had been through all the kind of conventional trauma that you want to talk about, and they were going through the same things. They're basically we're coming down to stress responses, responses to trauma. And a lot of people understand that there's fight or flight. Those are two responses that we have. And there's a good number of people that know that there's a freeze response, fight, flight, or freeze. But there are actually two more that are a part of that spectrum. One being, it's called fawn or flop. Fawning is turning away from what you're experiencing, or averting your eyes somehow. And flopping is the people that just drop to the ground in response to it. And so you have that response, and then you also have what's called a friending response, where people believe they have some sort of intimate connection with the experience that they're having, with that. And there were a couple of people that I interviewed that actually had that. They thought they had some sort of intimate connection with the creature that they were they were experiencing, they were encountering. And as fascinating thing. But there were over 80 people out of the 148 wanted to took the flight. They either took off immediately, or within a very short amount of time were on their way out of there in some way. There were a few people that had the fight response, which was kind of surprising to me. The people that would pick up sticks and rocks and be ready to go, to defend themselves with it. And, you figure you're confronted by a creature that's 8-9 feet tall, that's 700-800 pounds, and can run down deer and everything like that. And they're ready. There were people that were ready to fight them. I think there's over 30 of those. And it was incredible to talk to people about those experiences.
I interview people a lot that have personal experiences with these things. Most of them, it's been a while, and they've kind of come to terms with it a lot. Sometimes it was an isolated experience, and sometimes it's an ongoing experience, but certainly a lot of variety of incidences. I think a lot of people that probably have traumatic experiences may not be as inclined to talk about them. I don't know, did you find that to be true?
Absolutely. What I found was there were um, a lot of telltale markings of the stress response and things like that. Even some signs of PTSD, PTSD, that were part of it. But the big difference was that people who had this experience were very different from people that had traditional forms of PTSD. Those people, the people that have PTSD, the last thing in the world they want to do is talk about whatever they went through, because retelling is reliving, and you have to go through all that emotional response again. With Bigfoot witnesses, cryptid witnesses, they actually want to talk about their experience. They want to tell somebody. They want to share it. But where they're stuck is that the only thing that matches that is the fear they have of repercussion, of ridicule, of harassment, things like that. There were people that that fear of harassment and ridicule was so deep that I had one gentleman. He hadn't talked to anybody about his experience in 36 years, and he had seen my post, in one of the groups looking for folks to interview for the study, he thought he felt safe talking to me about it. There were people that had lost friendships over it. There were people that had become estranged from family members because of it. There was one gentleman even lost his job because of it. Yeah, because he was talking about his experience openly, and the boss didn't like it, and sent him packing. The stigma that is attached to this, and the repercussions that come from it are very real. So I came to call that type of thing. It's something that's different from PTSD. I came to call it cryptid encounter syndrome. And what that is, you go through all the classic PTSD, signs and the different effects and everything. But the difference is you want to talk about it, which is very different from PTSD, but you can't. You feel like you can't. You're just stuck in that merry-go-round of trying to be able to do that, to go through that. And the unfortunate thing is that these folks remember these encounters in stark detail, amazingly stark detail. One of the first things I do when I work with a witness is that I tell them, look, sit down and write this down or type it all out. Include every detail you can tell me about this encounter, and whether you think it's relevant or not, tell me what you remember. And you'll get 8, 10, 12,000 words from people, because they just want to pour it out there. And when they have an arena to be able to walk out and feel very safe doing so, you'll get an incredible amount of things, amount of information out of them. And one of the things that I teach other researchers to do is what I call don't rush the creature. Basically, when they go to interview, they'll sit down with a witness and say, okay, what did it look like? How big was it? Did it smell? What color was it? And they'll talk about this creature. And meanwhile, here's this witness who was going through a traumatic experience, and they start to feel like a dish rag that's being wrung out. And I usually start the interviews now with folks, and I say, how are you doing? Okay, how are you coping with this? Are you feeling okay with this? And the first few minutes of the discussion being about that person, being about the witness, is a huge step. And they start to feel more comfortable because you're concerned with how this has affected them. You're concerned with how they're doing, how they're feeling about all this. And when you express that kind of empathy, people tend to trust a little bit more, and they tend to share. And trust me, you get more information that way. If you just start talking that way, you'll get every detail that you ever wanted about the creature in the course of that interview. You don't even have to ask direct questions about it. Usually they'll bring up these things and during the course of that interview, and then I'll just ask a couple of short clarifying questions that doesn't get them off the beat. It doesn't get them off their track that they're on, but it'll get them, you'll get the information that you want. So the key thing to remember is that these encounters really hit people hard. And, we're talking about an effect that hits somebody when they re-experience that. They go through all the emotional trauma again. And that releases a chemical in your brain called cortisol. And basically, cortisol is to your brain what adrenaline is to your body. That's the best comparison that you can have. And what it does is it just fires up your brain and gets you ready for any threat that could be there. But going through these memories again triggers that. And there are some folks that go through that 2-3 times a day when something triggers the memory. And basically, you go into a state that's kind of like that's akin to ADHD. You become very irritable. You become very hyper focused on certain small details and things like that, and very hypersensitive to things. And for most people, that lasts 30 to 90 minutes. For some of the folks I talked to, they would go once they got a memory re-triggered, they would go through that for 2 or 3 days because it was so moving to them, and they had to go through that again. And it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing to experience. I experienced it. The reaction that I had to my first encounter was a form of that. The reaction that I had to my third encounter in the woods, what I mean, it was exactly that. I had gone through that myself, and to be then that actually that third encounter that I had, the reaction that I had to it, helped open my eyes and see the similarities of what I was feeling to what the people I was working with on an everyday basis were going through, and that's what helped make me make that connection for that. And I think it's important that we understand that this is real science. It's not speculation. It's not, throwing out some idea that I had. I followed it up, and I think that connection to real science and the way I did the study is one of the big reasons why I didn't get any blowback on what I'm doing. I wasn't giving my opinion. I was providing data, and that is a huge, huge thing for people in the research community. We can't just talk about stories. We can't just do the sexy stuff. If we want to find out what the truth is, we want to do some real research, you've got to do some things that produce data. And the more data that we have to operate off of, the closer we get to the truth of this mystery.
I think that's extremely important. And one of the questions I usually ask people, has to do with, what do you think will get us there? What will form some kind of a more concrete, I guess, information. And I'll just pose that question to you as well.
The answer that I give to similar questions is the scientific method. In seventh grade science class, we learned what the scientific method was. And if you approach everything with the scientific method in mind, then you are sticking to a rigid kind of regimen to be able to get you there. It's the discipline. That's the discipline that you need for your research, and it's right there on paper. You get your idea, you form your idea out of experience, out of different things that you notice, then you research it for a while. Then once you've got a good amount of research information done, you come up with a hypothesis. This is basically it's an educated guess that what you're going to do, of where you think you're going with what you're doing. And then you experiment, you figure out some way to generate data. The experimentation part is hard for people to do because there's a lot of folks that'll sit back and say, well, I'm not a scientist. Well, I'm not either. I'm a school teacher. I'm not a scientist, right? And the way to look at it is okay, what can I do? Either I'm going to examine, information, I'm going to collect data that's already out there, or I've got to be able to come up with a way to find it myself. And that's what I did with the study that I did, and that's what I'm doing with my current research, is to be able to go out and you get that idea and you're going to follow it up and you're going to go through and generate that data. And once you generated the data in step 4, step 5 is analyze what you have. Take a look at the data that you have. How does it fit? How close is it to your hypothesis? How far is it from your hypothesis? Excuse me. And once you have that, once you've gone through the analysis phase, you come to your conclusion. Did it match your hypothesis? What have you concluded from what you've done? And I'm sorry. The conclusion that I came to with my study was that these experiences people were having were genuine. And you can't, you can explain away. I apologize. You can explain away a certain number of encounters for different things. But when there were 148 people that I had all experiencing different or similar after effects, and those after effects are the same as other traumatic experiences, you have to at least get closer to the conclusion that these experiences were real. And that's where I anchored my work in real science that's done every day. So yeah, the scientific method is what people really need to adhere to. And the stories are great, but glean the data from the stories. And If you're able to go out and do your own research in active areas, go do that. I've been to the point last few years where my health has not been good, and I haven't been able to go out in the field. And I'm just getting back to the point now where I can head back out in the field. And I have a new research area here in New Mexico that my research partner and I are going to start opening up and start doing some work on. And there, don't just go out and look around. Have a point. Have a, have something that you want to go out there and you want to pay particular attention to. The best way you can do that is by not looking for the creature, is look for signs of the creature that it leaves behind. Tree breaks. This new research area that I went to, we found 3 different trees, full 40, 50-foot trees that had been broken off and leaned up against other trees. And they were anywhere from a quarter mile to a half a mile apart. But the thing was, they all pointed in the same direction that was down a stream. Basically, they were pointing to, or they're facing upstream, excuse me. They were pointing to the source of water that were in the area that we were in. And in New Mexico, water sources are very, very important, for surface water. There's not many of them. So we took that as a sign to be able to, to identify this area that was worth at least checking out. And there had been a couple of reports out of there that, people had some strange experiences there too. So it was enough for us to go out and open this up. But walk in there, walk into your research with a point. Don't let the stories dictate where you go. You figure out where you want to go, what you want to do right now. And my new research is along the same lines. I am now comparing the collective descriptions, the physical traits of Bigfoot. Okay, we all know what the profile is of, physical profile is of a Bigfoot. I got the idea through some research to be able to compare those to common physical features of people that have gigantism and acromegaly. And that's where I'm doing my work right now, is in that comparison, and how valid that comparison is, and whether there's a connection there or something. We're talking about a creature that's, for the most part, looks very human-like. There are some differences, but when you get to actual humans that are similar size to them, it's funny how there's a lot of, not funny, but it's amazing how there are physical features that are shared between the two. And I'm trying to figure out, I'm in the research stage of that. I'm trying to figure out why. But again, I got the idea, and now I'm in the research phase. And, I'll come up with a hypothesis here soon, and then I'll have to do some more widespread research and really get into, the data collection and see what's out there.
Absolutely. Well, I hope you share that with us when you get it. I'd love to do another interview with you. I think you have a wealth of information, and I look forward to reading your study. That's just kind of my thing. I like that kind of detail research. I like the personal stories too, but I like that kind of detail research, and certainly something I admire that people go to that much effort to do. Appreciate it.
Well, it's about the truth. I've had people for years and years telling me, boy, you got to write a book or something. You got to get this out there. And, until, a few years ago, the research for me was very personal. And it was, I researched for, 12 years before I even talked to anybody publicly about what I had been doing. Because it was all about my passion. It's, I've had that drive to just find the truth, and that's what it's all been about for me. And now I'm getting to a point where, okay, yeah, it's probably a good idea to start sharing this. People need this information. So I'm working on a book based on the study that I did, and I'm going to take some examples of interviews that I've had and include that, and talk about individual effects that people are going through. And it's important. It really is. I've found that there's enough people out there that are genuinely affected by this, and it's probably information that they need. And also, if anybody out there is having a tough time with their encounter, they can reach me, via Facebook. I'm the only Richard Daniels that lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So you can find me that easily on Facebook, and I'll work with you the best I can to help you at least find a place where uh, you can have this experience and be able to put it into perspective in your life. And that's the important thing, is you have to understand that these experiences do fit into your everyday life. You may not want to, you may not want to lead a conversation with somebody with that, but it is part of your life, and it is something that you need to be able to come to terms with yourself.